Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for The Mandalorian Season 3, Episode 7. So second last episode of the season, just one more to go, the season finale. Interesting with this episode, of course, this was shown at Star Wars Celebration a couple of days ago. And so I think, there were spoilers out there, I believe, but most of what I had heard was mainly spoilers of the, I think, clip that they showed earlier on, rather than specifically the full episode. So the only thing I really knew going in was like the nature of like the opening scene. I didn't know the way the rest of the episode went. So obviously straight away, this episode is a marked shift, a marked improvement over the majority of the previous episode. Of course, it's a direct continuation of the very opening stuff and the ending stuff from last episode, but a huge step away from what the middle of last week's episode was. They got right back on track, and in terms of some of those celebration reveals, it feels like they finally got a sense for more of what specifically they want to do with the Mandoverse going forward. So if you've seen the Ahsoka trailer, of course, they introduced Thrawn basically through that. Now, we knew he was coming eventually, but that combined with basically this episode really kind of tells you that we are building up to the return of Thrawn to kind of create the final threat of the Empire before, I guess, the First Order kind of build up ends up being kind of what we actually focus on. And that is what the Mandoverse, what all these shows set in this era are kind of building towards. And this opening scene here was the scene that really put a lot of the pieces together for us to give you that greater sense for what we're actually trying to do. While the kind of, I suppose, core of the episode progressed our kind of plot here of we're actually going to Mandalore, Bo-Katan is our leader of this now kind of united group of Mandalorians, and we are here, we're trying to reclaim the planet, but it's a trap. Or at the very least, there was something they didn't account for, and that is that Moff Gideon had basically created a base in Mandalore around the Great Forge. And this is a hugely shocking moment, and we'll get to, of course, a lot of the plot details that actually happen. But at first, I think we have to talk about the opening scene here. So we get the meeting of the Empire Shadow Council, as they call themselves. So this is the various leaders of the different kind of remnant factions of the Empire. It is revealed that they are purposefully giving the impression that they are scattered warlords, so that basically the New Republic doesn't unite and take them out. That if they're just effectively borderline pirates, just with Imperial stuff, you can let them go because they're not doing that much. But if it ever became a full-on, this is the remainder of the Empire truly united, then it would happen, and they're obviously planning quite a lot of stuff. And this was fascinating because, of course, they revealed, of course, Moff Gideon, and this is where he has been taken. So he was obviously broken out by his own men, I suppose, Imperial Super Commandos, or what, pseudo Dark Troopers with Beskar armor, whatever way you want to kind of interpret it. But it was his own people who broke him out, and he's straight back into the Shadow Council. And that is basically his, I guess, role, is that he is the leader of this base on Mandalore. And he's actually requesting more kind of air support. And he requests 3 Praetorian guards, which of course we do get to see. Because interestingly, when he brings up the idea of the threat of the return of Mandalorians, you can see the other leaders are kind of shocked. And they're like, no, not them. So I think that what that really probably serves to highlight is, one, the legacy in the world of Mandalorians, but I suppose how crazy the Night of 1,000 Tears actually was. Before that kind of resolved itself, you kind of get the impression that was the battle of all battles on that planet, and even the high-ups in the Empire are kind of like, we don't want that. We don't want this group getting in our way because they are such a challenge to deal with. But there was so much going on in this scene because you had obviously Moff Gideon and his whole thing, and we'll get to his kind of motivation, what he wants to do a little later on. But you of course had the guy advocating for like, we've got to wait and plan for Thrawn's return. Thrawn is coming. He's coming back imminently. That's what we're all waiting for. He will unite us. This is our chance to strike once Thrawn comes back. Moff Gideon, of course, is just like, I know about all this information. I've heard nothing about Thrawn. Is he going to be here anytime soon? So that's obviously being set up in the background. You had, I suppose, Hux from the sequel trilogy's father here, who is leading Project Necromancer, which is very on the nose, but it's finally a sense of like, there we go. The kind of cloning tech, this is the project linking all that stuff together to get us to Palpatine's return. And Hux views that as being the true next stage of the what the Empire should be. So I like that there's a little bit of debate about the exact plan. They're all sort of ultimately supporting Project Necromancer, but they're a little bit like, you know, have you actually made any progress with it? Some of them are a little bit skeptical about Thrawn isn't exactly here. And then here's Moff Gideon kind of talking about the threat of the Mandalorians, which they ultimately all agree with does need to be dealt with. So he gets his support, and that's why the trap works so well on Mandalore later on in the episode. So hugely significant scene, and watching it a second time just before I recorded this video, it's so interesting to go back to that initial scene and be like, oh yeah, like he's meeting with them there from his base on Mandalore as they're talking about the Mandalorians. It's a interesting little thing. So massive scene in terms of the series, in terms of establishing so much about what exactly we're doing here. We also have to keep in mind that, like, just prior to the Shadow Council scene, Elia speaks to Moff Gideon and explains that, oh yeah, the pirate attack was basically orchestrated by Moff Gideon. And he's like, who supported them? I thought you said the New Republic wouldn't help. And she's like, no, they didn't. It was the Mandalorians. Which Mandalorians? He really wants to know which. And it was like a combination of Bo-Katan and like Din Djarin's forces, basically. And I love that Moff Gideon's response to this is like, no, they hate each other. That would never happen. Like, almost like, you're lying to me. I know the lore. These two don't like each other. That's wrong. The Mandalorians are doing it wrong if that's what's actually happened. Because they're establishing, and what they ultimately get to with Moff Gideon is that he wants to have an empire that rules by basically, instead of just taking over and sort of like forgetting about the people who they kind of conquer, instead we'll conquer everyone, but take the best parts in a way of everything. We'll take some of the good parts of the Jedi, some of the good parts of the Mandalorians, and of course the Empire, and combined we'll have the ultimate way to kind of bring peace to the galaxy. So you could tell that like this is someone who very much like is interested in the Mandalorian culture himself. That's why he's so interested in the Darksaber and knows all of this stuff about their culture. It's why he ultimately gets Beskar armor himself by the end of the episode. He is this sort of wannabe Mandalorian, but of course there's so much of their culture he doesn't care about, but aspects of it he is interested in, like the kind of leader having the Mandalorian lightsaber, basically, and the strength of their armor, but there's so much else he doesn't care about at all. And I think that makes him quite interesting because, you know, that's to some degree like an element of Thrawn, who seeks to understand his enemies by like understanding their culture and art and stuff like that. But Moff Gideon probably just takes it to a degree of just like, you know, the people we take over still have their strengths, even if we're more powerful. Let's use them to our advantage, ultimately. So, super interesting stuff. Now, I think at this point we probably should bring up the name of this episode. I think it's just straight up called Spies, or The Spies, plural, Whereas the only spy we necessarily see in the episode is, I suppose, Elia is basically revealed to be a spy. Moff Gideon, you could say, is sort of a spy master in terms of how he operates. But you would not come out of this episode necessarily thinking that immediately there's a ton of spies in the episode. Now, this has obviously led to a lot of speculation about, was there a betrayal within the Mandalorian forces that led to them being sort of further pushed, drawn into this trap? That it wasn't just that, like, Elia gave information to Moff Gideon, he was able to prepare for what was coming, and that's what happened. But also that there was assistance on the Mandalorian side of things to make it a bit easier for them. And this is where we need to go into, I suppose, the kind of middle section of the episode where we get more focus on our Mandalorians sort of like coming together. Now, to me, the main candidates for if there is a traitor in our midst is definitely the remnants on Mandalore that we just meet up with for the first time in this episode. The main reason for which being, they're the ones who proposed the idea, we will take you to the Forge. Now, I didn't necessarily take from the episode the idea that they had full on been there and were bringing them to this place they knew about. It was more just that they've been on the planet post what happened longer than anyone else. So they know where the previous locations actually are. Not that they were super familiar with the abandoned forge and know exactly where it is and that they can just set up shop there. Now, there is the potential that they do a thing where like they were the ones who betrayed them. But I got the impression that it was more like, we stayed away from any activity, but we know where places are. And it was just as much of a shock when they went in there that this happened. Because there's that line of dialogue that, like, anyone who tried to explore deeper into the planet underground never came back. So I take that as being the idea that anyone who came close to almost uncovering the base that was being built died. And so I think that kind of takes the ones who stayed on the planet the whole time maybe out of the picture. Beyond that, I think our candidates are probably Axe, who's quote-unquote the leader of the kind of privateer Mandalorians, or the Armorer. Both of which, because they both have moments where they kind of leave the main group and basically escape the disaster that happens conveniently right before it happens. Now, both for kind of two very different reasons, both have kind of different kind of scenes within the episode. So with Axe, who I'm probably less inclined to believe is the traitor, just because they did set up the idea that effectively you have on the kind of covert side, you have Paz Vizsla, on the other Mandalorian side of things you have Axe. These two are basically positioned as being that sort of kind of pseudo second in command on either side of things. And so these two have a little bit of a rivalry on opposite sides with each other. This is meant to sort of, in a way, represent the feelings of both sides as like the two characters who probably very staunchly represent their tribe the most. And so these are the two most likely to come into conflict with each other. And that's exactly what they do. They establish that there's no immediate animosity, but you can tell it's on the verge of like anything could cause this to happen, which is obviously a setup for later on when the disagreement over like the board game resolves into a fight, it seems like, to the death eventually. And Bo-Katan is kind of like, well, something like this I think was always going to happen. We've got to let this play out. Both sides can't really intervene in this. And it's only stopped from being a fight to the death because Grogu intervenes to kind of break the two of them up. Which I thought was a very interesting moment because Din is like, I never thought him that. Because if he had done things the Mandalorian way, he wouldn't have done that. So I very much took that as being a sense where, like, if you're looking at Grogu's trajectory, I don't think they're necessarily going down the path where Grogu is just going to be a full-on, straight-up Mandalorian. I do think we are heading for Grogu as being a kind of Mandalorian Jedi, kind of half and half, where he can follow the way to a certain degree, but he also has kind of Jedi kind of aspects to him as well. I think that makes the most sense, where it's not necessarily about one or the other. There's a way to kind of merge the two together, and that probably makes the most sense. So that was quite interesting. But obviously, with the way the episode actually goes, we then get to the them falling into the trap. They're ambushed, and Axe is the one to be like, I can get out of here really quick. I could definitely make it out. I'll call for reinforcements because we've just been full on ambushed here. And they're kind of like, no, you won't make it. But then Paz actually speaks up and is just like, I'll give you cover. There's a gap in the roof. You head out. So the two of them actually go from fighting each other to actually working together. And I took that to be a sort of sense where, like, there's a togetherness here, even if they don't fully agree with each other. And okay, he ends up leaving the battle and how things actually go. But because they never actually resolved what was going on up in space, because obviously previously, getting into the Armorer a little bit, the Armorer made the decision earlier on when they found the remnants to be like, I'll take their injured back up to our kind of like capital ship, basically, our cruiser, on the Gauntlet. And that's what the Armorer is doing. They even have a scene with her basically starting communication. But it's almost weird the way that scene is presented, because it's like, if you're just dropping them off at the ship, why do you need to almost like linger on that scene if it's straight up a drop off, but then you don't actually show it? All you show is her coming into contact, and they cut with like the implication that you just assume the obvious thing is going to happen, because this is what Axe is ultimately coming up to call for aid from, is from their support in orbit. So the big question is, like, I suppose, which of them is doing the right thing versus, is one of the betrayer, or are we all reading into this a little bit too much? Is anyone actually a traitor in all of this? I'm not sure, but again, the episode is called Spies, and I'm not sure if you can necessarily say just that Elia and Gideon alone account for all of that. I think the reason that Moff Gideon was so prepared for what was happening was, I think, that he got the tip off that they were coming. Now, like I said, going back to Axe for a second, why I don't think it's him, because of what happens to Paz, because Paz Vizsla has his last stand and dies. To me, if you were going to do the betrayal of Axe, I think you would have utilized the feud with Paz and had Axe be there to see Paz kind of fall and be like, I made this happen. And I think even if it was just individually to Paz, reveal him as the traitor as that happened. If you're emphasizing Paz and Axe, I don't think you would just have Axe leave and have him be like, hey, he's gonna die, like falling into the trap, when like everyone else has fallen into it. Otherwise, I did feel that like Axe's presentation in general over the episodes was very much like he's just representing as like the main character of the new Mandalorians, like what's going on here, and he seems to actually care about everyone else and was involved in things in a relatively normal way. So I think that all is fine. The Armorer, obviously, she also leaves, ferrying the wounded. It's like, cool, but why her? There's a little bit of a kind of like, could you not just have sent one of the other random Mandalorians to do this? Why does one of your leaders necessarily have to be the one to do that? The other point is, when Moff Gideon reveals himself in his armor, his helmet at least, has horns on it to some degree. The only other Mandalorian that we see who has horns on their helmet is the Armorer. There's also the point that we don't actually know who the Armorer is. She's not given a name beyond her title. And there's almost a hidden aspect to who she is. The fact that she kind of has been a little bit all over the place, maybe to some degree, in recent episodes with regards to she's leading the covert, do things the right way, and then all of a sudden Bo-Katan comes in and she's like, oh no, you can take off your helmet, we're doing everything now. That to some degree, the person who has chosen the trajectory of where we're going has actually been the Armorer, in terms of she's been the one to decide we're going to take Mandalore. Now, is there even a kind of traitor in the first place? Because you would assume, if it was the Armorer or maybe one of the Mandalorians, that Gideon would have been told a little bit ahead of time that they are more united in this. Ultimately, probably reading too much into if there is actually a spy within the Mandalorians, but we'll see how it goes, because they did cut away. Like, the episode ends before you actually find out what's happening to, like, the fleet in space. Obviously, they've sent out all their fighters, and we're going to get, I suppose, that happening as Bo-Katan tries to escape, because the key thing that happens as we go into the final scene of the episode is they're charging through. They're attacked by basically the Imperial Super Commandos / Dark Troopers. It's a little bit weird because most of them are all wearing like white. They're not particularly dark, but you know, the Imperials wearing Beskar. Pretty cool fight scene here. They obviously the Mandalorians push them back, but it's kind of clear they're being guided back in. Din is kind of up at the front, and it's almost just unfortunate that by the time they get to the door and find the base, it's Din and like a couple of random Mandalorians who are the ones who walk past the door. So when Gideon realizes they're in position, the door closes and Din is trapped like basically in the base, whereas like all of the rest of the Mandalorian force is just trapped in the corridor. And so I think the others get killed. Din gets captured straight away, and he's sent off for like debriefing / interrogation. I was convinced that they were either gonna potentially kill off Din then and there, or they were gonna just like forcibly take his helmet off, and that would have been like a bit of a shocking moment. Now maybe they might still do that in the final episode because he's captured, and because I suppose Moff Gideon would understand to some degree the nature of like taking off the helmet being important. He might do that just to get in Din's head, but an interesting position to put Din in, certainly, because he's obviously been captured this season, but this is a much worse situation than before. There's a sense of, can we actually go back and get him given what has happened? Like, we need reinforcements more than almost just the ships that we have above. Can we actually go and get him back? Because the others only escape because, you know, Paz Vizsla makes his big sacrifice and just goes crazy with that Gatling gun kind of repeating blaster and just takes out a bunch of people, kind of clears the room. And it's only like him being injured from the fight up to now, and then the arrival of the 3 Praetorian guards that actually take Paz out. So I think they did a pretty good job. Like, this is probably the tech development and then kill the character done, in my mind, like a lot better than they did it with tech in the Bad Batch. Just because it actually felt like we went from borderline knowing next to nothing about this character other than there's just the grumpy guy, to actually realizing, no, there's this real sense of honor and loyalty to this character. In a way, the scene where like Din was talking to Bo, if you kind of apply the kind of ideas of what's being talked about here, this is what the covert ultimately values a lot, is like the honor, and he held the rear basically as everyone else went to escape. Bo-Katan was able to use the Darksaber to cut a hole in the door that closed behind them, and they all managed to get out, but he had to sacrifice himself. The scene between Bo and Moff Gideon was interesting because this gets into, like, she does in this episode finally reveal kind of like the history of what exactly happened, because they meet up with the remnant Mandalorians and they actually explain like, oh, this is what happened. We'll never surrender Mandalore, but Bo is forced to admit that actually, like, I did. The Night of 1,000 Tears went so badly in a way, like the losses were piling up. It was only a matter of time before we did eventually just full on lose. They offered a ceasefire, and I agreed to it with the caveat that you don't hurt any other Mandalorians. But I think from what was said by the leftovers that they found here, it seems like the Empire didn't fully agree, like commit to those terms. And so I suppose she knows now she can't negotiate with the Empire at all because they don't, you know, stand by their word. And so her surrendering is effectively how she lost the Darksaber to Moff Gideon. They don't seem to suggest that they full on had a fight and that's how he claimed it, but that her surrendering was giving up the Darksaber, and that's how that exactly happened. So that's an interesting one, and it's obviously like the idea that she actually surrendered because she cared about her people, which makes kind of Din all the more loyal to her, because she's felt a little bit detached to him, but now he realizes that she does actually fundamentally care about her people a lot. So that was quite an important scene. So that was kind of good to get, to just know that, like, okay, some of those behind the scenes details were good. Yes, I think to some degree, I think a lot of people were expecting them to do maybe a flashback sequence where we maybe saw this, but because they wrote it in a way where, like, it doesn't appear that Bo and Moff Gideon directly fought, I think it can be told in this way because it is just, like, negotiations happened, I agreed to surrender, and that's how it actually happened. And obviously from their perspective, the leftovers, we find out that they stayed on the planet the whole time and just migrated around the planet, avoiding any kind of like issues as things kind of went down. So that answers, like, you know, quite a few questions. It probably saves them maybe having to do certain flashbacks to certain scenes. It probably still opens the door that, like, if Bo comes back for Din and she has more of a direct confrontation with Moff Gideon, you maybe have the opportunity to still bring up some sort of a kind of previous dynamic, but I'm not overly sure exactly what way they're going to do it there. But it does leave the situation kind of, like I said before, it's an odd situation that they're in, where, like, the survivors are kind of free because they've sort of been locked out of the base effectively. They know it's too dangerous to kind of go back in, but Din's captured in there. What do they do? They're obviously going to try, potentially, I assume, to reinforce themselves, maybe kind of flee back to Navarro by getting back up to the ships. But because Gideon was prepared and has already sent out, like, the bombers and stuff like that, that's a key point. He also requested bombers. So I'm assuming that they might do some sort of thing where they take out all the kind of ground ships that they landed on. And it's going to be a lot on, can the fleet in orbit kind of hold the line? And where does that put, like, the armor? And what's going on with her? What's Axe been doing in the time since he left? And then again, is anyone a traitor or not? What has actually gone on here? Can we fight back? For instance, like Din's starfighter, where is it in all of this? We assume they brought it with them, but, like, he's not there to fight in it. So is Bo gonna get in that? Might we get a cool scene where, like, Grogu pilots it, because he was sort of told how to pilot it, but can he do the fancy moves? We don't really know. There's certainly a few options, and then you kind of wonder, like, where exactly are we going here? Because, like, they didn't fully, like, directly announce season 4 at Celebration. I think they alluded to the fact that, like, there's obviously going to be one, but they didn't announce it like they announced other seasons of other shows. So, and because we know Thrawn is the ultimate goal, it still leaves the possibility for them to, like, basically, quote unquote, defeat Gideon in the next episode. But I have a feeling they'll continue with this for a little bit longer. So I'm assuming at the very least we're going to have to free Din. I'd be surprised if they kind of end the Bad Batch and the Mandalorian both in the same way, with, like, one of our main characters captured, and the next season is just all about getting them back. So I'm pretty sure Din is going to have to find a way to get out of this, or someone come in to save him. Like, in terms of, like, open plot points that we still have, like, say Grogu, for instance, like, it feels like we're waiting for Grogu to do something a little bit more. Like, the whole setup of, like, IG-11, now IG-12, which is now basically a mech suit for Grogu, they didn't really showcase the capabilities of that thing. Grogu knows how to operate it, but, like, it's still an assassin droid, so there's obviously weaponry, and I assume they're setting up that Grogu's going to have a bit of a moment where he goes a bit crazy with the droid controlling it. So how do you get Grogu into that action effectively. What exactly are we doing here? Where are we doing our last stand? Where are we doing our next assault? How do we actually make this happen ultimately? And then, yeah, like, do they defeat Moff Gideon here and have, like, the Mandalorians basically reclaim Mandalore? Like, an Imperial base falls, but the idea is that we know in the background the Shadow Council knows what's happening with this, and Thrawn is coming. Now that they, like, the fact that they were confident enough to just put Thrawn in the Ahsoka trailer, I think opens the door to, like, you can end this season on Thrawn is back in play. So if Gideon falls, or is fully taken out of the picture, I think you can just reintroduce Thrawn and be like, yeah, we did this. The other point with Grogu is that he is required, we assume, still, as part of Project Necromancer, because my assumption still remains that it's Dr. Pershing's cloning technology in combination with the incredible special force-sensitive DNA of Grogu/Yoda's species that is the key to Project Necromancer actually happening. Now, there was a little bit of an extra thing here where I think between Hux and Gideon we got across the idea that Gideon is kind of doing a little bit of everything himself. Like, you can tell he wants to be the leader of the Empire. He also wants to kind of make progress on Project Necromancer himself, where you saw the cloning tubes, but they didn't emphasize it like a crazy amount. So I don't know. And then, like, there's, like, Navarro. Like, I don't know if Greef Karga can necessarily come back into play. You wonder, like, will we randomly see, like, New Republic reinforcements actually kind of show up here? That will kind of be a little bit of a kind of surprise kind of moment where I think they're all expecting that, like, the New Republic is, like, useless in all of this. So it will be kind of a cool, surprising moment to actually see if the Rangers are maybe able to actually muster up a pretty big force to just, like, arrive next to Mandalore and kind of help win the day. Because I don't think the Empire would be actually properly prepared for that if it happened. And it would really show that, like, oh yeah, we need to be even more careful. Moff Gideon maybe made too big of a noise and drew in the New Republic. But the fact that, like, Alaya is still out there and she ultimately reports to Gideon makes me feel that they're not getting rid of Gideon anytime soon, particularly. But, you know, it's gonna be absolutely fascinating, and it's amazing, again, going from episode 6 to 7, how much the sort of opinions have kind of changed, and suddenly the show feels a little bit back on track. You would still say ultimately, like, in terms of, like, where we were in, like, season 1 and 2, I understand that a lot of people have some slight frustrations that the show has gone from being Din and Grogu, you know, what are they doing this week, to Din and Grogu are not necessarily the focus of most of the episodes at all. So what are we actually, like, building towards with them? Because if you need Din and Grogu, you obviously have to free Din again. But then, you know, is it just something like happens where, like, they manage to get Din out, but Grogu gets captured? That's a way you could do it. Like, Grogu sacrifices himself to get Din out. That's probably potentially the way you maybe have to do it, because ultimately Grogu feels like he has to serve his plot use. I guess his DNA blood has to get used, and saving him allows the Mandalorian at least to be driven towards doing something. But like I said with the Bad Batch, I'm not sure you necessarily want just rescuing people to be, like, the only plot that you can do in Star Wars these days. So I don't know. I'm just intrigued about where we're going. So gonna wrap up the video there. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on this episode. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.